Good morning and welcome. My name is Matt Compton and I head up the data management team at Bytes. And I get the honour of welcoming you to today's event, which will be focused on cloud applications. Now, today's event is part of a wider event that we've been running for the last 3 days. We've run a number of sessions focused on different aspects of cloud security across network, endpoint, identity, and data. If you haven't managed to visit any of the previous sessions, don't worry, everything is fully recorded and is available on demand on our website, as will today. So if you do need to jump out for any reason, that's absolutely fine. You can come back and look at the recording later on, or jump in and jump out. In terms of a little bit of housekeeping, obviously the top line there explains itself. We're trying to make this session as interactive as we possibly can. So obviously it's a bit more difficult when we're not face to face. So we've put a few polls throughout the session, and on the right hand side of your screen there is a section where you can answer those polls. And also, if there's any questions that you want to ask throughout, then please put those questions in those box. At the end of the 3 speakers that we've got today, we're doing a quick Q&A, and then we'll then revert at the end before we close off the event with a formal Q&A with everybody that spoke on the session today. Feedback to us is hugely valuable, and for that reason, we are offering a £100 voucher out of a prize draw for filling out the survey at the end. It does only take a few minutes, and it really helps us tailor these events to make them as beneficial to you as possible. So please do take the time to fill that form out. In terms of the agenda, I'm going to jump on in a minute and go in and around spend 5 minutes just around Bytes, our security practice, and how we help organizations, and run through the challenges of what we see today. Then I'm going to be handing over to Kieran from F5, who's going to be talking about the security of the application. I'll then be handing over to Stephen, who's really going to be focusing around the data and the data itself around the application. And then we hand back over to John from Forcepoint, who's going to be looking at the protection around the data in the application. And as I said, we jump on at the end. I'll talk about a couple of assessments on how we can help customers, and then we'll finish off with a panel Q&A, and then we let you go off just in time for some lunch. So who are Bytes? So Bytes have been on a big journey, especially in the last couple of years. So Bytes Software Services and Security Partnerships were 2 companies up until very, very recently. Bytes come from a heritage of licensing and asset management, 30 plus years in the industry, and Security Partnerships were a dedicated security outfit offering heavy technical resources, first, second and third line. There was an acquisition that happened 10 years ago between Bytes and Security Partnerships, and both organizations ran side by side for around about 10 years. A big step change around this time last year, where we merged both companies together. What this now gives us is a true powerhouse in the UK in terms of the resource that we have to be able to service our customers around all aspects of security. We have a huge team, and we deliver a huge amount of business because of the resource and credibility that we're able to provide to our customers. In terms of that kind of timeline and what that looks like, I'd say over that 10 years, both organizations grew and grew and grew, but it's really the merger and how we've kind of integrated the 2 organizations that's really the game changer for us. So I won't read any of the awards at the bottom, but we're very proud of the business that we've been able to create and will continue to create, and the feedback that we get from our customers. In terms of how we do this, and it really is, we look at the full lifecycle management and strategy management of the integrations, the interaction that we have with our customers. So for those of you that work with Bytes, historical Bytes, we are famous around the procurement services, around licensing for the likes of Microsoft and other kind of huge players in the market. However, when we now bake that into the professional services resource that we have within the organization to deliver and enable our customers to leverage the technologies that are in the market, really gives us a step ahead of what we believe our competition are able to do. Wrapping things around with full managed services through our managed SOC, and then bringing in our cyber consultancy. So whether that's at the start of the engagement that we have with the customer or through that lifecycle management, making sure that we're providing you with the expertise to be able to get true benefit from the investments that you get. And wrap that around with 24/7 support desk. And I don't mean that's a support desk where you speak to someone and you get passed off to a vendor. We're talking about first, second, and third line ownership of support calls when they come through to our support desk. So before I hand over to John, you should see a panel coming up on your screen as I cover off the last slide. So the panel should be coming up, but just to summarize what you can expect in the next 90 minutes or so, we'll be talking about cloud applications and the security challenges that we have around them. And I just wanted to kind of highlight 3 areas that we really want to cover and what we see as the biggest issues with this, as kind of SaaS and cloud has grown at an exponential rate. Visibility of the application and visibility of the data, as that data sprawl and application sprawl happens across your organizations. Making sure that you've got the security controls that you had, similar to what we had in an on-premise world, and the management of that. So giving IT ownership and controls and security of that data, and that can only be done if you've got all of these 3 areas covered. So I'm just seeing a poll come through. So have you had enough coffee yet today? So we run this poll on the earlier one, and tea came out at top. However, maybe a few of you that have been on both sessions are maybe getting a little bit of Zoom fatigue because another cup of coffee have come to the forefront now. So yeah, I managed to get a coffee in before this. So yeah, always a good thing. So I will finish my bit now. I will be handing over to Kieran, and I'll let Kieran introduce himself. And I'll be back in a bit. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. As Matt said, my name is Kieran Shepherd. I'm a Principal Solutions Engineer here at F5. Been with F5 about 10 years now, so seen a fair few changes within the application delivery market. Now, agenda is very simple for me. I'm going to set the scene. I'm going to look at the problem that we're seeing within the industry, and then I'm going to pose a couple of use cases of where we're looking to solve some of those problems. Now, I guess the first question from me is, what is the most valuable asset? Now, don't worry, this is not a poll. We're going to give you the answers here. But the most valuable asset of the modern enterprise, if we go back a few hundred years and look at the days of kind of Henry Ford and Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller, it was physical capital. The people who had the physical capital, the steel, the cars, the oil, they were the giants of industry. Move forward 100 years into the 1900s, and then really it was based around human capital. So if you had the great minds and the brains, and we saw the big consultancy firms and tech firms like IBM and McKinsey coming up through the ranks, then, again, you were the giants of industry. Shift that forward again to where we are today, and it's really the application capital. If you are the king of the application capital, you are the enterprise giants. And, we can see that. Look at people like Airbnb and Amazon and Uber. They might do physical things underneath. Airbnb might provide property for people to go and stay in, but they don't own any of those property. They own an application. Amazon sell things, but a lot of those things they sell are owned by other people. Uber don't own cars, but they, drive millions of people around the world because they have applications. So really, apps run the world, and that shouldn't be a surprise to us today. We hold a mobile phone in our hand not because it's an amazing piece of technology, it's because it runs fantastic applications. Without those applications, it's just a brick with some chips and silicon. So 98% of organizations here report their applications are critical. And we're not just talking about the Facebooks and the Amazons here that are saying they're critical. The corner shop is saying it's critical because they rely on applications for their credit card transactions. Your local home worker who's selling stuff through Amazon, it's critical. So it really is, critical to have those applications. Now, if we look at where we are in the last 18 months, 12 months, we've all been through a very drastic change, and some of those changes have really driven and accelerated the adoption of applications and technology. We've seen a digital transformation that's accelerated in the terms of months rather than what we had set out of probably Horizon 1 and Horizon 2 in terms of years. Businesses are really having to cut back now, not just purely for efficiency, but because it's critical for the survival of the business. And customers themselves, they're really just a click away from switching brands. And because of this, customers really want a rich application experience. They demand it. If your application is poor, slow, poor performing, doesn't interact very well, doesn't fit to their mobile phone screen the same way it does to their Apple Mac or their Windows machine, they will just turn away, and they can turn away with a click. They don't even have to vote with their feet anymore. So from an application owner and deliverer, whether that's enterprise or whether that's small business, delivering these expectations, it's not an easy problem to solve. The applications can be complex. We all know and have seen every day in the news the possibility of security exposures, whether that comes from the traditional applications we host and someone throws in an SQL injection and steals our customer data, whether it's something we're seeing more often like supply chain attacks, where they're attacking people like Microsoft Exchange or SolarWinds to get inside an organization and then go and grab your data. Complex applications deliver more exposure to security vulnerabilities, which obviously effectively deals with more security exposures. And visibility is another key thing. Lack of visibility across your portfolio just leaves you blind, especially when we come to the security aspect. Now, from talking to customers, and I never see a customer that says, or very, very rarely do I see a customer that says, yeah, we've got everything and it's just in our data center, or actually everything's in AWS and it doesn't live anywhere else. What actually happens is the digital experience they're trying to provide is just stitched together. And it's stitched together because we have applications living at the edge, whether that be content delivery. We have the logic maybe living in public cloud. We may have some private data still living within the on-premise data center. And that also means that the applications are, a blend of traditional and modern apps. So when I say traditional modern apps, I'm talking about applications that may be born in the cloud, may be born into microservices and container architecture, so they can lift and shift from one cloud to another. But again, it just adds complexity, and complexity is obviously a problem that we're trying to deal with, especially when it comes to the world of security. Now, from an F5 point of view, I said I've been with F5 for the last decade. What we try to do, the problem we try to solve is deliver this suite of technologies that sit along the application path. And that tends to be sit between two areas: securing the application and delivering the application. And there are, we're not going to go into product and details today, but there are varying technologies that we try to offer our customers along the way to deal with that problem. And what we're trying to do is make sure that those technologies can be delivered across all of those environments. So the first thing we have is commonality. We have a common approach to security, so that the security you deliver in your public cloud is the same security you deliver on your private cloud, and can also be pushed to the edge, wherever that edge may be. Now, and remember, long gone are the days where edge is just content delivery and we're shoving static pictures out to a client from a POP. Edge now is, application at the edge, compute at the edge. So we're pushing more and more complexity into the edge as well. Now, trying to manually stitch all of this together, it's not very scalable, doesn't work very well. Trying to write scripts to automate processes, is not ideal. And again, the whole thing we're trying to get away from is complexity. The applications are driving complexity. We want to simplify the process, so we, from a security standpoint, can simplify the security that sits over the top. So these challenges, all this complexity, all of the questions you can see on the right-hand side there, it starts to become an untenable solution. So the utopia from F5, the vision that we would like to see is to have all of these services available across all delivery platforms, for customers to be able to take telemetry, push them into a centralized resource. And that centralized resource doesn't have to be an F5 resource. We see lots and lots of customers moving towards the open source market space for things like that, like Prometheus, Grafana, rolling their own in terms of security and reporting. But say the main message here is driving a common solution across all those areas. So, we can automate, we can secure the portfolio, and we can allow the customers to expand and lift and shift, or as my colleague Stephen would say, lift, shift, and tinker, so we can actually move applications from one area to another. And this is something we're seeing quite common as well, because the first driver for lifting applications was to get them out of a data center and into a cloud, so they could move to that scalability, elasticity from a CapEx to an OpEx model. But now we're seeing customers say, well, actually, I want to be able to just take that application and at the drop of the hat, pick it up and move it to that cloud, which is fine from an application point of view, because they are developing modern applications in terms of microservices, in terms of Kubernetes that can be picked up and moved into varying different clouds. But the security piece that sits in front of that, that's going to be a problem. That's where we need the commonality across all clouds. So get my clicker here. Now, point of view, the things we're trying to achieve is to shift left. Perfect situation there, the small child running in. So what we're trying to achieve there is shift left. Now, what do we mean by shift left? I'm sure it's a term a lot of you have seen before. Shift left, from our point of view, means being able to take the security and application delivery we're providing and move it into the tools that are used by the people that build your apps, your development teams. And they're not using F5 consoles, and they're not using F5 Beacon. They're using Git to store their repository. They're using Jenkins pipelines or GitLab pipelines. They're using Terraforms and Ansibles. So making sure that the tools you're building can deploy into their world is of paramount performance, because if you can allow them to add security using their tools, the chances of them building your security into the application is 100 times higher. It becomes frictionless for them. It just becomes infrastructure as code. They just point to an API and they pull it down. The other important thing around that, if you're looking at APIs, is to make sure that you look at the vendor that has declarative APIs. And what I mean by that, as opposed to imperative, is a declarative API is going to help you deploy your tools as simply as possible. Because I know F5, I've worked for F5, so I know I can control anything through an API, and I can go and build, let's say, a web application firewall. But I know that I have to build a node, and then a pool, and then a pool member, and then a virtual server, and then I can apply the policy. And there's a very specific order to that. But that's fine, because I have domain-specific knowledge about F5. Your developers don't give two hoots about how F5 works. They just know that it's providing a web application firewall to sit in front of the apps. They want to tell it the name of the app, tell it the name of the policy that they want to pull down from GitHub, and hit deploy. And that's where a declarative model of APIs really comes in handy, because again, it's an enabler for your security to be moved into the DevOps world. Now, click the right area here on the screen. Adopting to modern architectures is going to be, key to this. Now, we mentioned before around, containerization and things like that. So across this kind of portfolio of what F5 are doing, we're trying to achieve that. Now, the logos you can see at the bottom, they're all F5 companies, all part of F5. F5, you obviously know, they've been delivering ADCs for the past decade. Nginx, I'm imagine that nine out of 10 people on this call will know. If you don't know them from the reverse proxy and the things F5 built from Nginx, you'll know them as the world's most popular web server. Currently 415 million web applications run on Nginx. They have, just in the open source world, 35% of the web server market share. So the fact that we're the market leading in ADC and have the world's largest footprint in websites makes us in a very good position to be able to deliver this security for web applications. Now, what we're trying to do with the shape piece, that really is around our artificial intelligence and automation. And again, that really only comes to works well if you're dealing with big data. So if we look at things like shape, we're looking at 1 billion plus transactions per day. We're looking at 100 million logins per day. And it's dealing with that type of data that we can offer back to our customers to solve some of these issues. Now, I'm going to run forward into the brevity of time. I'm just going to look at 2 specific use cases here. So first is looking at that Nginx one. Now, we mentioned the complexity of modern applications and being able to move your security into those environments. And that's something really where Nginx comes into its own, because modern environments really mean I've got a customer that's building an application in Kubernetes or managed by Kubernetes and running those devices in containers. And trying to do your security right at the edge on a gateway, it's great for inbound, outbound traffic, or what we call north-southbound traffic. But what about the intercommunication traffic where your services talk to each other within your Kubernetes pod and your Kubernetes cluster? What about traffic that never actually goes back out to the outside world? Trying to run, even the traditional F5 inside a container, it's not going to work. It's 2 gig to download an image compared to 100 meg for an Nginx image. So using a tool like Nginx, which is small and lightweight, and let's face it, most of the other services we see in this environment, they're built on Nginx open source anyway. Look at Kubernetes. The default ingress controller is built on Nginx open source. So being able to apply security onto Nginx with Nginx Plus, that's the enterprise arm of Nginx as opposed to the open source, and move it into those environments makes perfect sense for a lot of our customers. Now, the second use case I want to talk about, and hopefully between that slide, there will be a poll pop up on your screen. Now, I can't see that poll from where I am, but that poll effectively is asking you if you have your clouds and your security run across multiple public cloud environments. And the reason we're asking that is because one thing we've looked at F5 is a company we ended up purchasing called Volterra. Now, Volterra was set up by a chap called Anker, who actually set up a company called Contrail, which they sold to Juniper for the SDN networks. Now, he set up Volterra, which F5 purchased a while back. And the way you can think of Volterra is effectively the glue. It is the glue that tries to stitch all of your underlying architectures, and we're talking about your cloud architectures together here. So whether your data sits in your own private cloud or it sits in Google or AWS or Microsoft, Volterra sits over the top. So think of it as your SDN layer for cloud. So if we think of SDN for local networks, you can run commodity hardware and your SDN sits over the top. For Volterra, we let you run your services and your application on any underlying cloud architecture, and Volterra sits over the top as an abstraction layer so that layer becomes invisible. It doesn't matter whether you move the applications, it doesn't matter whether you bring them in or out of public and private cloud or move them to cheaper cloud or better performing clouds. Volterra takes care of the stitching underneath. And that goes back to our original messaging, is to try to simplify all of this complexity that we're seeing customers bring and organizations bring by utilizing the tools that we have today. And those tools are moving into public cloud, building modern architectures, running applications in Kubernetes. It's all adding complexity, and that's what really we're trying to achieve here. So all of the kind of the logos and the tools and control mechanisms we talked about today, Volterra is really kind of the glue that's hopefully going to stitch all that together. The other thing is we understand from an organization that, as customers, you've made huge investment in many other vendors, not just F5. Some of those vendors are on the call today. You're going to be spending lots of money with these vendors, and you're probably going to run those vendors' tools in public cloud as well. So if we can help the simplicity and deployments of your applications, you're more likely to use not just F5 tools, but the tools from other vendors that you're utilizing in those clouds more efficiently, because you can run them in an abstracted layer rather than dealing with the complexities of the cloud underneath. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense. We're doing everything because, back to our original point, in that we all rely on applications these days. They tend to run the world. And with that, I think I've managed to get myself ahead by a couple of minutes, and I will hand back over to Matt.
Thanks, Kieran. Thank you for that. And whilst we wait for any questions to come through, let's talk about the poll. So unsurprisingly, there was nobody that came back that said they're not in the cloud yet. So everybody answered they either use more than one or using one, and it was a 50-50 split on that poll. So everybody has at least one cloud application. And 50% of you have more than one, so it could be significantly more, and 50% of you have one. So as the questions, let me just check coming through. So we have had a question come through, and it says, Kieran, do I need to be running Kubernetes to make use of Nginx app protect?
Good question. Obviously, in the conversation we've made, we've kind of tightly coupled that conversation with Kubernetes and Nginx, but there's not a requirement. What we're saying with Nginx is it works really well in that environment, because Nginx itself can be run inside a container and then be part of that container orchestration. But you can run Nginx, you can stick it on a standard Linux distribution if you want, and run it almost like a gateway. We see customers doing this when they're running it as an API gateway. But yeah, absolutely, they're not they're not closely coupled that they have to be run in Kubernetes.
Okay, cool. And I can't see any others coming through, so that's fine. If you've got questions and you've just missed this slot, that's absolutely fine, because we've got a Q&A at the end. So Kieran, we'll probably, or no, not probably, we'll then speak to you again shortly once we've gone through kind of Stephen and John's bit. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.
And I will hand over to Stephen from Varonis.
Hello all, hopefully you can hear me okay. I can see that you can see me, so that's good. There's a slight delay there. Okay, so a little bit of a change of pace, I guess, from the last session. And we're going to talk about particularly one specific application in this case, and that is Microsoft 365, Office 365, or however you want to call it. I kind of I liked the end of that presentation in terms of, apps run the world, but where would apps be without data? And data is kind of what Varonis is all about. It's about understanding, monitoring, managing your data wherever it sits. And whether that's on premises or what we're going to be talking about today in Microsoft 365, having the ability to know what it is, know who has access to it, know what they're doing with that access, and understand how that fits with your compliance and regulatory requirements. So a little bit about Varonis, I've kind of touched on it there really, but on the left-hand side of this particular slide, you can see the various sort of infrastructure and data stores that we cover at the moment. We're going to talk today pretty much exclusively about Office 365 and basically the data that is held within there from an unstructured perspective. So really that's going to cover SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Teams. However, Varonis as an organization has a strategy to basically follow the data. So if we go back to the apps that we were talking about before and the repositories, we're really going to roll out more and more support for other locations in various clouds, throughout this year and beyond. And the idea of that really is that we give you the ability to, if we go up to the sort of wagon wheel in the middle there, classify that data, understand what it is and where it is, look at the users and groups and the access to that data and what permissions they have, and crucially, what are they doing with those permissions? and then marry that up with telemetry around Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, and perimeter telemetry around things like DNS, VPN, and proxy to build a cybersecurity and data protection platform that allows you to answer simple questions around the use cases on the right-hand side. In other words, where is my data? Who has access to it? Is that access appropriate? How is that access changing? Can you alert me on when something is accessing or someone is accessing that data that shouldn't be? And how do we map that against this new world of work, which was touched on in the previous session, where we all sit in our home offices or wherever we want to work from, and we don't perhaps have the controls and management of over every aspect of our infrastructure that we perhaps had in the past. So how does data get overexposed in something like Office 365? Well, I think most people would say that moving your data from, say, a file server to Office 365 should add, a level of control and management that perhaps you didn't have in that environment. And to some extent, that's true. However, what Microsoft Teams does is build on top of a lot of tools that were never really designed to support the platform in the first place. So when you create a team, you create an Office 365 group, create permission groups under that in Azure AD. You create at least one SharePoint site, you connect into Exchange and OneDrive for Business, as well as every other application, including now video streaming. And all of that sits basically in SharePoint repository. So you suddenly have a whole host of new environments that have been spun up by your users. What's really interesting, though, and getting back to the point I mentioned a minute ago, is that just like, perhaps unlike SharePoint best practice a few years ago, Teams is designed to have flat permissions. So if you're a member of the team, you have access to everything in that team. And that is the same if you joined yesterday or you were in the team from the start 2 years ago. And so what is happening is, as Teams is rolled out to organizations, thousands upon thousands of these are being created on a weekly or monthly basis. Users are being encouraged to create them. And yet, when they do, there's no real permissions management being appropriate to that, apart from having the team itself. Now, Microsoft obviously heard a little bit of this feedback, and they actually responded, and they built something called private channels, which allows you to have a subset of the permissions within the team. So if you have 10 members of the team and you want a channel within that team, which is kind of like a subset of the area, to only have 5 members in it so they can work on maybe more confidential files, you can do that. Unfortunately, that creates another SharePoint site, and another SharePoint site, and another SharePoint site. Hopefully where you can get where I'm going with this. You can have up to 30 private channels per team. And so for each team, if you have 30 sites, each member of your organization is creating one a month. How many SharePoint sites do you end up having in that environment? And how many of them do you actually know what data they contain and the access to that? It gets extremely difficult, and it gets exacerbated by the fact that if you want to answer some of those questions, there's no one single platform to go to. You can't just go to SharePoint Online and get all the answers. Likewise, you can't join every team and have a look at every membership there. You can't see the groups and members fully in Azure Active Directory either, and data can be also shared in OneDrive. And so what you end up with is a situation where you have a couple of different problems. One is scale. People are building out these environments, constantly as they collaborate in the way that Office 365 is designed to support. But you also have an issue where it's not really clear what data is in there, who's getting access to it, and what are they doing with that access. So if we go into this a little bit further, you can be a Teams member, but you can't see the members in SharePoint Online. Likewise, if you share the team from SharePoint Online rather than sharing it with the team owner doesn't get that visibility. OneDrive adds additional data storage locations, and we have, for example, Delve and other search capabilities in Office 365 will actually show members, so users within your organization, information held in teams that perhaps they shouldn't be part of. And so this proliferation of access, of links, of sharing, both internal and external and public, means that, again, as Teams scales, it becomes extremely difficult to answer the sort of questions that we started with, which was, where's my data and what's happening to it? You can make a decision, for example, to turn off external and public sharing. Maybe you feel that's too much of a risk, but then what's your alternative? People emailing attachments, using shadow IT. Internal, external, and public sharing in Teams is good. We want people to be able to use this kind of functionality within Office 365. The problem is controlling it, understanding how it's set, and understanding the information that's in there. Something as simple as finding out how many private channels you have isn't even available to the SharePoint admin. And all of these visibility challenges build up and build up and build up as more and more unstructured data gets pushed to the cloud. Even if you turn external and public sharing off, insider risks increase with this collaboration. You still have people added to various locations that shouldn't be. People don't clean up access. They don't delete teams well enough. They don't understand the data that's in there, and they don't understand membership of those teams changing over time. All these gaps in visibility potentially leave sensitive data open to either insider threats or compromised accounts, whether or not any of these people are external or not. Now, you should have a poll popping up around about now in terms of how much information is actually held within Office 365 for yourselves at the moment. Varonis provides additional value regardless of whether you've got 90% of your information in Office 365, 100%, or 1%. We will provide additional value over on top of whether you license for E3, E5, or any combination of Microsoft licensing. The first way we'll do that is we'll help you prepare your data for cloud adoption. So if we just take Microsoft 365 to one side for a second, we can link into your on-premise file servers, your NetApp boxes, your EMC, whatever you have on-prem, and we can help you classify, categorize, and map user activity to that information so that you know when that data is moved into Office 365, it's moving to a SharePoint side that has the right permissions, not just a replica of what permissions it had on premises. We also help you with cleaning up that data, removing the stale data, understanding its classification so you can determine whether sensitive information is allowed to move into Office 365 or not. I talked a little bit about risk prioritization at scale. Unfortunately, as your environment grows, the tools that Microsoft provide out of the box in E3 or E5 don't give you the ability to be able to map and answer these questions at scale. And so what we're trying to do here with the Varonis platform is basically give you one location where you can see information across your whole organization, what's happening to it, and who has access to that information. That leads me on to hybrid, which is really, really important within this environment. Most organizations are going to be in some sort of hybrid, maybe even permanently, and have some data on-prem and some in Office 365. The reason for that might be compliance. It might be from a performance perspective. Large files need to stay local. But at the end of the day, it's difficult or nigh on impossible to answer questions around access and compliance when you can only see half of the equation at any one time. So Varonis provides you with a single place to go to look at access auditing, classification, changes to data access, permissions visibility, and full hybrid threat protection. So if someone compromises your Office 365 tenant, uses those credentials to move on-premise, move laterally across on-premise, and then starts to exfiltrate data back out through, say, OneDrive for Business, for example, we can see both sides of that equation at one particular time. And so, again, the reason for the poll was very much to think about where you are in that journey. Do you need to work with Varonis to look at your data on premises to make sure that it's actually going into the right taxonomy in SharePoint Online, Teams, and OneDrive, etc.? Or have you moved most of that data in there? And what you really need to understand is what type of data is that? Who is accessing it? What are they doing with that? And how is that internal, external, and public access changing over time? So just to drill a little bit more into what this looks like from a sort of day-to-day perspective, Varonis provides sort of high-level dashboards for you to be able to see and report on exactly how your Office 365 environment is changing. And this can be something as simple as how many teams were created last week, how many of those teams contain this type of sensitive data, how many of those teams have external users on there. The idea of Varonis is in a couple of clicks to be able to drill down and understand exactly how that information, so your environment is changing, and then be able to pass that information over to data owners within the business to say, okay, this is the information that you're responsible for. These are the teams that contain it, and these are the people that have access to it. This is really, really, really hard to do without a tool like Varonis, and it's impossible to do if you're also then including any sort of on-premises component as well. We have accurate classification across all data using a single classification engine, which has multiple rules and patterns, but applies both on-prem and cloud. And we also partner with Microsoft to be able to automate on-premises labeling. So if you're using a technology such as Microsoft Information Protection, we can take those labels, inject them to your on-premises data before it's moved to the cloud, meaning that your DLP, your Microsoft Cloud App Security, your rights management templates fire only on data that they're supposed to and become more effective. Something that's really difficult to keep a handle on with Office 365 is where links are being created. And as you can see with this dashboard, the resolution is not great on here from my perspective, but we can see various different types of links that have been created. External sharing, internal sharing with effective everyone access, as well as public sharing. And also sharing to specific users where a specific person within or external to the organization has had information access granted to them at any particular place. As I said before, when it came to links, Varonis gives you one place to look at every link that's associated to a team, to a SharePoint site, to a OneDrive, or any asset between them. And obviously, you can then report on alert on the changes and access that's present on your unstructured data. We do the same thing by sites as well. And as I've said, all of these things are exacerbated by scale. If you have 10 teams, a lot of this isn't an issue. When you have 100 or 1,000 or 10,000, or some of the numbers that I see in my enterprise customer base getting up to hundreds of thousands of teams, you start to get to real problems when it comes to the creation of these sites, how often it's happening, and what they contain. Again, Varonis takes away that fog, removes the lack of ability that you have to not be able to see where those teams are, who's created them, and who has access to that information. Obviously, things like private channels, public teams, again, we can tell you where they're being created, who by, and whether they're appropriate or not. The final thing I'll touch on as well is, I mentioned slightly before, is outside of the data and compliance, we also look at introducing a cybersecurity element on top of everything we're doing. So if you think about what I've talked about most here, what are we really talking about? Well, we're talking about where is the data and how sensitive is that data? Because ultimately, data is what any external threat, any threat actor, any ransomware, that's what they're after. That's what they're in here for. Nobody breaks into a bank and steals the pens. They're in there because data is the asset, right? That they're after. They either want to encrypt or exfiltrate to harm your business. Because Varonis understands the data and where it is, and we understand the user access to that data and how it's changing, we can build out what we term peacetime profiles for what normal access looks like. So we can answer the question, Steve works from this location or from this device for this times of day. He accesses this type of data, as do his peer group, and this is what he does with it. Now, should Stephen suddenly start accessing things from different locations around the world, from different devices, maybe unmanaged devices, starts looking at exfiltrating data that he's never touched before, data that's stale, that no one's ever touched before, all of this starts to build into an event that eventually becomes an alert within our data alert system. And we've really started to build out more and more of these alerts around telemetry from the cloud. So for things like Azure AD, Office 365, SharePoint, Exchange Online, all of those feeds, alongside the things that we take from on-premises, which is things like Azure Active Directory, VPN, DNS, and proxy information. All of this is combined together to provide both threshold and user behavioral type alerting, which then effectively is delivered out of the box across the whole platform. The whole idea really of this is that you can track potential threats to your data from the cloud to on-prem to back to the cloud and back again. You can make sure that anything happening to your data is within the bounds of normal. And if you want to investigate that, Varonis provides you with a fantastic forensic capability to drill down into each of the events that cause this alert to fire and understand what's happening with them. The final thing I'll mention on this, is just conscious of time, is we also then integrate with SIEM providers such as your Splunks or whomever, push this information as fully formed alerts into those environments to make sure that if you want to take Varonis alerting and combine it with other telemetry from areas that Varonis doesn't touch, for example, you can do that and actively manage those alerts. So it's important to understand that while Varonis is concentrated very highly on making sure you understand where the data is, getting down to least privileged access, monitoring changes to that access, giving you visibility on that and the ability to remediate those changes if necessary. All the time we're doing that, we're building out a profile of what normal looks like for your business. And a lot of times within our client base, it's only Varonis that has picked up zero-day type threats because it's not been the dropper, it's not been the antivirus, it's not been something from a software perspective that's actually triggered the alert. It's been the activity of accounts that have been compromised that have allowed Varonis to pick up on that. So a couple of final questions to consider. We talked about the poll. Where is the majority of your unstructured data located? This really just frames how you're going to talk to Varonis, what the services we can give you, whether we're looking at both an on-premises or a cloud environment, and whether we can help you prepare your on-premise data for that move into Microsoft 365. When it comes to your Microsoft 365 licensing, although Varonis adds this capability onto any licensing pack, it's really always useful to sort of understand what you actually own and what you're going to do with it. Because what we're trying to understand here is where Varonis can complement and help you get the value out of your E3 or E5 purchase. We're not looking to compete. We're looking to help you turn on things like external sharing. Use it with confidence because it's good, but you need the ability to know what's happening, and that's what Varonis provides. Can you tell me how many teams you have? How many you create per week? How many of them are public? How many contain sensitive data and who has access to them? I'm going to guess the answer is no. And for most people, that's the case. And even when I worked for Microsoft, I was probably in 50 or 60 teams at any one time, and I couldn't tell you for the life of me which ones of them contained data that was sensitive. Some of those I even owned. And it's not because people don't care, it's because of the nature of collaboration. It's ever changing. People's roles change and what they're trying to do is change. If this last year has given us any indications of anything, it's shown us that things change very quickly and we have to have the tools available to be able to understand that. How do you track user activity? You mentioned before that you're all using cloud apps. How do you know what's happening? Where is the data flowing? How is it flowing? Who's moving it? Who's creating those exfiltration events and external links? Again, if you can't answer these questions, it's something to definitely consider. Data subject access requests. Some organizations get a few, some get too many. How do you answer them? How long do they take? What sort of resources are you actually throwing at each one of these? And is there a better way? The answer almost always is yes, because you want to be able to automate this as much as possible. And unfortunately, for a lot of organizations, it really does take a lot of man hours out of the IT team or the data protection team's time to answer these questions. And finally, if the worst would happen and you were breached, how comfortable do you feel tracking that across your Office 365 to your on-prem and back again? And how comfortable would you feel being able to sign off that you knew all the data that was touched and all the accounts that touched them? Varonis provides an instant response team free of charge to all our customers, and we really are trying to become the first responders for our customer base to help you investigate this type of breach. But ultimately, it comes down to every organization has to make their own determination of whether the tools they're using or not are relevant. But what I would consider is, if this has been of any interest, please reach out to Bytes or to Varonis around getting a demonstration of this, potentially deploying it in your environment, and we'll give you the visibility of what's going on with your unstructured data. Unlike Kieran, I'm slightly over, so I'm going to hold it there and pass back over to Bytes.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you for that. And I suppose from just kind of closing statement from me, Bytes' pedigree around Microsoft means that we service a huge amount of customers with their 365 deployments, and the team challenge is real. There's been a huge uptake in the platform because of where we find ourselves, and the governance and the visibility of the data has kind of been a secondary challenge. And we've helped a huge amount of organizations to help provide them with the governance tools from Varonis to be able to give them the visibility of the data that's moving in and out of the organization. In terms of the poll, it came back. So there was 4 options. Nobody came back with 0%. Unsurprisingly, the top answer was less than 25%. 60% have less than 25% of their unstructured data in Office 365. And then it was a flat split between more than 50% or all their data. So there are some people on the call that have all their data in 365, but most people have a unstructured data sets that sit outside of that. And that is the most common answer that we find from speaking to organizations. We've had a couple of questions come through, so we've got time quickly to answer them before we hand over to John. So first one, Stephen, it's a good question. I like this because we get this a lot. As Microsoft has security compliance and governance tools as part of the E3 and E5 licensing suites, why would you need Varonis?
Yeah, it's quite simple, really, for all the reasons I mentioned on the presentation. There are some classification tools within Microsoft. They're quite basic and difficult to tune, and as you roll out at scale, they're challenging. Outside of that, you have a lot of different portals, a lot of tools, and a lot of confusing technology that's been sort of bolted together to try and form a whole. Now, they are working on trying to stitch this together and make it more, make it more efficient. But ultimately, what we find is that you need to be able to classify your data. You need to be able to do that accurately. Pretty much none of E3 or E5 touches much on premises apart from the AIP scanner. We feel that regardless of where your data sits, there is a requirement to be able to have an efficient and effective way of tracking and managing data movement, changes in access and changes in activity. And fundamentally, E3 nor E5 do not provide that. And as someone who I worked for Microsoft for 7 years, I was an Office 365 technical specialist. I've spent a lot of time in a lot of large customers where the story is one thing, but the actual full deployment of all those tools and actually getting it to work leaves these gaps that Varonis fills.
Yeah, thank you. And in terms of what we've seen Microsoft do in terms of their development around their security stack, there is elements of that that's absolutely kind of best of breed and
definitely,
and areas where we see customers deploying Microsoft and using it and it doing a fantastic job. The compliance and governance suites are something that is still a little bit behind the best of breed players in the market like Varonis. Who knows what the future will hold, but certainly today Microsoft do not provide the level of feature sets that Varonis will provide you. One more question. How does Varonis see itself in the security ecosystem? DLP, SIEM, or something else?
Yeah, I think something else. So we're not a DLP. We're not stopping data from moving out the organization. We're certainly not a SIEM. We don't take information from devices or particularly from the whole network or there's a lot of areas that Varonis doesn't play in. What we are is a platform to understand data within your organization. And the way I like to look at it is, if you're investing in cloud, you're investing in all these other tools around, DLP, SIEM, and the other stuff that we're here today to talk about. All of that works better if you understand your data and your users. And that's what Varonis provides you. Helps you get down to that least privileged access, helps you manage and contain data growth, and it helps you respond to breaches in a way alongside those other technologies that is most efficient.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steve. And I will now be passing over to John. And Steve, I'll speak to you again after John's bit for the final Q&A.
Sure.
Cool. Brilliant. Thank you, Matt. Right. First check. Let's see if the clicker works. There we go. That's me. So really good sessions. Really enjoyed listening to those. Hopefully I will be able to do as good a job. Just to quickly introduce myself. So my name's John Enger. I'm a senior consultant sales engineer here at Forcepoint. Some organizations describe us as solution architects. I've been with the business 16 years. And so hopefully I've got a range of experience, which I can provide some useful commentary for you today. For those of you who are not familiar with Forcepoint, Forcepoint was an organization which grew out of a number of companies, WebSense, StoneSoft, Raytheon, and then they merged to form a new company. So although Forcepoint as an organization has only been around for a few years, the organizations which it grew out of have all been around for a couple of decades already. So again, we've got a long history of experience in the security space. Now, for this session, I really wanted to sort of like take a look at why do we need data protection everywhere? And one of the things you've already heard from Kieran, you've already heard from Stephen, is that although it's very much cloud first, cloud is the dominant architecture moving forward, it's not cloud only. And so when we're thinking about how we're going to enforce the protection of that cloud data, we need to consider not just while it's in the cloud, but what happens to it after it's been taken out of the cloud, whether that's onto a device, maybe from your cloud into somebody else's cloud, and so on. And in order to achieve that, I'll talk briefly about how there's, if you like, 3 key points of control. Then we'll have a look at some of the traffic steering and monitoring options. And then in order to move beyond, if you like, a traditional DLP mindset, and which is often auditing based, we'll talk about the importance of understanding user behavior and user intentions and how that can make for more risk adaptive policies. So, like I was just saying, cloud first doesn't mean cloud only. Cloud doesn't always stay, data doesn't always stay in the cloud, even when that's your primary tool. Right, so it's important that we actually have, if my clicker will go to the next slide, there we go, that we actually have data protection everywhere, okay? Now, every single security product in existence, when you boil it down to its bare essence, it's all about connecting users with their data securely so that they can work safely, okay? Now, every organization have users. Most of those would probably be staff. They'll be employees, right? But you might also have customers who connect to your system, suppliers, partners, various third parties, and so on. And you're going to have personal data about all these organizations. You know, it could be related to their employment, their health, whatever. And there are regulations which require you to keep that data safe. And of course, all of these users, when they're working with very sensitive information for your organization. Now, what that information is will vary from organization to organization, right? It might be supplier contracts, it might be source code, it might be blueprints, it might be health records. It varies from organization to organization. But the importance and the sensitivity of that data remains the same. It's just the nature of the data itself which changes. Now, what then becomes interesting is that all these users, they're working with data in all different ways. Yeah, they're creating data, they're interacting with it, they're sharing it, and they're doing this across a range of channels. You know, predominantly today we talk about cloud applications, cloud services, cloud storage, mobile devices. You know, we talk about collaboration tools, you know, things like Slack, Teams, but also more traditional tools like email. We talk about storage in terms of USB drives and locally attached devices, especially in today's world where more people are working from home. And so there's more of this, if you like, shadow IT being involved, just because that's the reality of what we're all doing today. And this is where business happens, right? Business happens by the users creating this data, by sharing it. And that is actually what makes data security really quite hard, right? Because these points of business, these channels where it's exchanged and interacted with, that's also the points where data leaves your business, right? And if you just block it from happening, you're blocking business. So that will not work. And this creates a number of challenges, right? And they're pretty straightforward. we've already heard about it, right? You start to lose visibility everywhere the data is. It becomes harder and harder to see who's doing what and when with this data, right? And so you try to put data protection policies in place across all the channels. But if all the channels are all using different tools, those policies become fragmented, right? And that introduces the complexity, which we heard about before. And that complexity means that the policies can't stay up to speed. They can't keep up. And so the policies become static and reactive. That's really not very effective when you're talking about protecting your data, right? Now, the solutions to achieve this, again, you'll hear echoes of this from what you've already heard from Stephen and from Kieran, right? You need to be able to discover what's happening. You need to discover where that data is, how it's being used, what's being done with it, right? And you need to have unified policies across your entire estate. Cloud, absolutely, cloud first, but not cloud only. And if you can understand a bit about the user behavior, as we'll see shortly, then you can start to implement more dynamic policies, which can proactively protect you. So all of a sudden, you can provide more effective data security. But the key to it all is you have to have these unified policies, which will work across your entire estate. So in order for that to work, in order for that to be effective, you need to think about, where are we going to protect this data? And there's actually like 3 points of control, okay? Sorry, wait for the slide to catch up. So you've got the endpoint, you've got the gateway, and you've got the cloud service, right? In some of the earlier sessions, we were talking a lot about SASE platforms and digital transformations and how the security stack is being raised up to the cloud. And we're seeing this conversion of content and network security. And this is a great starting point, because SASE platforms are becoming trusted hubs for traffic steering, for content inspection, for policy enforcement. And particularly in the pandemic world, they can be very cost effective with our increasingly distributed environments. Of course, there's then techniques, simple things such as certificate pinning, can actually neuter that man-in-the-middle inspection. Also, you'll often get pushback from businesses because inline controls can be disruptive. So as great and as vital as SASE is, by itself, for the inline controls, it can't do everything, which puts more pressure onto mitigations elsewhere. So within the cloud service, for example, you might take advantage of API controls. And this offers benefits of being out of band, so it doesn't interfere with user experience. Right? It doesn't interfere with the performance in the same way. You've got remediation controls you can put in there. And when you're using these native capabilities, it offers minimal disruption to the user experience. However, a lot of these native controls, they're not truly real-time security today. Some are better than others, but most of them are after the fact, almost by definition. And also the security controls available in one particular cloud platform or one particular cloud application are different to other platforms. And so you start getting inconsistent controls. And also, let's not forget, the APIs, they're defined by the vendor. So you're at the mercy of whatever the platform provider gives you. And actually, if they decide all your API calls are becoming a bit of a pain, they might choose to throttle that. So it's a great solution, but by itself, it's not all you need. We can go to the other end of the communication chain. We can look at the endpoint, right? And the great thing about the endpoint is it has visibility of content before any transport or storage encryption. So it doesn't have the same challenges as the man in the middle. And only endpoints can manage data in use on devices. Only endpoint agents can control local peripherals and those kinds of things. However, they won't secure access from unmanaged devices. Yeah, and it can also consume device resources. So depending on the power and the newness, if you like, of the endpoints the laptops, the tablets and so on, which you've got, that may actually impact user experience as well, right? So what this means is that you actually, when you're thinking about protecting cloud data and enforcing those cloud data protection policies, you actually need to consider all 3 points of control to protect the data, not only when it's in the cloud, but also when it's moving between clouds, between devices, and then when it's being used on those devices as well. So that really brings in the importance and the benefit of having those unified data security policies. If you have the capability to cover those 3 points of control within the same policy, you can have a much easier to manage, much more effective data security policy than you can if you have these balkanized solutions. And yet this seems to be pretty rare, which I think brings us to our first poll, right? So hopefully you're getting a question pop up to tell you, do you have unified data security policies today? How are you achieving that? Now, as with a lot of the questions, we'll give you the chance to have a think about them, give the answers, and what we'll do is we'll come back and look at the results at the end in the Q&A session so that we can be sure to get through all the content at the time we've got available. Now, the other item is not only do we have to think about the data when it's in the cloud, but also we have to think about the devices which are accessing that data. Yeah, and we have to think about the cloud services themselves. In both cases, they might be managed or unmanaged devices and assets, devices and services. And whether it's managed or not obviously affects how we can steer the traffic to them, how we can monitor and control the data as it's in use. Some of it's pretty straightforward, right? If you don't control the device, you don't control the service, then you're not going to have any control at all. But that's kind of okay, right? My app, my service, it's none of your business. Nobody really has a problem with that. The other extreme is also easy. If it's, your Office 365 tenant and you're connecting to it from corporate devices, it's easy. You've got the full range of controls. Where you start to get into some of the gray areas and some of the complexities, of course, is where you don't control one end of that communication. So if I'm using my corporate device to access a personal Office tenant, is that acceptable? Do you want to control that? Do you want to prevent that? Because you know what? Taking corporate data and putting it into a personal tenant is a classic area of data leakage, right? How can you control that? Taking it the other way, maybe I'm trying to access the corporate tenant from my personal device, right? So I'm not going to have endpoint agents on there. What can you do to protect yourselves there? So let's take a look at that. Essentially, when you're looking at these protections, you've got 4 broad areas, right? You've got API controls and scanning capabilities, which are out of band. Then you've got some inline capabilities, things like endpoint agents, forward proxy controls, and reverse proxy controls, or strictly, I should perhaps say, SSO enforced reverse proxy controls, so that you can then force unmanaged devices through. Now, we already covered the best case and worst case scenarios. So let's have a look at the more interesting ones, right? If you don't manage the device, but you do manage the tenant, and you do manage the IDP, the single sign-on, you can put in these API-based controls, because that's at the end you can enforce. And you can force unmanaged devices through if you implement SSO enforced reverse proxy. However, reverse proxy can have some challenges. APIs, as we just talked about, and scanning and so on, data at rest scanning tends to be after the fact. So you kind of want to be inline, really. Forward proxy is typically a better solution for that. Agents, if your endpoints support it, is typically a better solution for that as well. However, it's an unmanaged device. So now you've got to think about, do I want to allow that? Because I don't have control there. If I flip it around, where it's a managed device, but it's an unmanaged service or an unmanaged asset, it's the exact opposite. I can control the device, so I can put controls onto there. I can force proxy settings, I can put agents on, right? But because I don't control the assets, I can't control the sign-on process. I can't integrate with the SSO, right? And you know what? The third party is not going to let me go after their APIs. It's not going to let me scan their tenant. So again, I've got another decision to make. So that brings us up to our second poll. Do you allow unmanaged device access to your cloud services? And it should give you some options of whether it's completely unrestricted, you don't allow it at all, or perhaps somewhere in the middle where you put certain restrictions in. And again, it's really interesting to see the different flavors which come from different organizations and different segments. So we talked about how we have a decision to make. A really good governance aid is to start to think about those cloud asset controls, the first pass of a decision tree. Am I going to allow access, or do I want to allow access? And if I do want to allow access, what kind of controls do I need to put in place? You know, it can be as simple as, for example, if you want to access the cloud services and that cloud data with a thick client, maybe it's something like Dropbox, which does certificate pinning. I can't inspect it in line. Perhaps I want to put an endpoint agent on so that I can see that data before it goes down into the terminal, so I can see what's pulled down and what's in use, right, and so on. Of course, that brings us also onto potentially the elephant in the room for any DLP solution. A lot of organizations only actually deploy their DLP in monitor-only mode. And why is that? Well, it's because actually they feel overwhelmed by the volume of incidents, you know, or they're scared of actually putting blocking policies in place and interrupting business. You know, the false positive rates and the cost per incident to investigate is often too high. And so they don't take full advantage of it, right? So we've just been talking about all these different ways we can put controls in, and then people don't use them. The solution to that is having highly accurately classifiers, not just simple regex and keywords and that kind of stuff, but proper fingerprinting, proper machine learning, complex scripts, things which can correlate events over time, and flexible policies so that customers can only block when they really need to. Because moving beyond simple monitoring is where you start to get the greatest value from DLP. Right. So let's have like a little worked example about how you can go to move beyond monitor only, right? And how administrators can be overwhelmed in normal circumstances. Imagine that, you know, I've gone into, you know, my CRM and I decided, all right, I'm going to take customers' credit card data, all right? I'll just print it out. It's all right, I've got DLP endpoint, it blocks it. Okay, so that's irritating. Maybe I'll stick it onto USB. That's all right. I've covered one of my control points, blocked again, right? Maybe I'll stick it up to my, you know, my personal cloud storage. That's okay. I've got a CASB microservice as part of my DLP solution. That can block it as well. Maybe I'll go old school, try email. No, my email gateway can stop that. Oh, I'll try a different cloud service, all right? Maybe, again, you know, I'll flip backwards and forwards between old and new solutions. Maybe I'll do FTP. People forget about that now, but it's still there. It's still prevalent. What you're seeing from all these activities, you know, this, I'm trying to do something and I keep getting blocked and I keep getting blocked and I keep getting blocked. That behavior indicates I'm risky, right? Yeah, I'm either bloody minded and not following the process, or actually, maybe I've got a more malicious intent. Either way, somebody needs to have a chat, but my security team doesn't know, because all these events, they get lost in the stream. Imagine if you've got just 20 staff going through all these different events and going, oh yeah, that block correlates with that block, correlates with that block. Now scale that up to 2,000 or 200,000. It's just not realistic. That is why it's very difficult for administrators to turn on blocking comfortably, because any single one of these actions can be business as usual. So they can't block based on a single action. They need to block based on a series of actions, on a pattern of behavior. So let's have a look at that again using dynamic data protection, right? It's the same 6 actions, right? But this time, each action is contributing to a dynamic risk score. So the first one, no big deal. The second one, no big deal. Because you know what? Maybe I forgot the policy and I'm just trying something else. Maybe I've got a technical problem. We don't want to be bothering the administrator, right? But after a while, that risk starts going up, right? Until eventually it's a very high risk and I need to be blocked properly. With dynamic data protection, the security team can be alerted to the risky behavior because that risk score is going up, saying, hang on a minute, admin, you want to take a closer look at this. And also, because we can base policies on these risk scores, they can automatically prevent the data from leaving the environment. So what does that look like in the UI? Well, by having risk adaptive policies, we can filter out that noise, right? In a traditional DLP solution, for any given rule, there's one risk level, and that's why you have the audit only, right? With risk adaptive protection, the first few layers is business as usual, right? It's just building up the risk score, which will naturally go up and down based on your behavior, but you can carry on getting your work done. But if you cross too high a threshold, then suddenly the administrator's being notified. You're still not being blocked, right? Because again, we don't want to get in the way of business. However, for the riskiest users who keep on going, we can actually then turn on the automatic blocking. So the result is that customers, organizations can have the experience of audit-only mode for business as usual. The security team can still mine the logs and get alerts to identify data exfiltration and tune policies, but these are now more focused, so they're not getting buried in the same way, so they can use their time more productively. And best of all, they can now leverage those analytics, that automation, to not only identify, but now also block their riskiest users automatically. So to summarize that rapid quick fire, all right, your cloud data protection solution should include endpoint, network, and cloud service controls to ensure full visibility and control so that you can protect your cloud data wherever it is and however it's being used. Your governance program should define who, what, where, and how data can be used so that those risk adaptive policies will actually make sense, and so that you can accommodate the inevitable exceptions which will need to be applied for certain privileged users. To make this work, you need unified policies which will apply across your estate, with the added bonus that by having these, it will reduce complexity, it will eliminate gaps, and it will lower costs, as well as improving your security. The key to the automation behind this is having those policies which will adapt to changing user behavior in real time. And that's how you get both more effective protection and you can streamline your day-to-day operations. So, oh, let's skip, we've had that one. Thank you very much for listening. I think I've actually, in my haste, I've managed to claw back a couple of minutes. So I will hand back to Matt to see if we have any questions.
Yeah, thanks, John. Really good session. And before we go into those questions, let's just cover off what we got from the poll results. So the first question was, do you have unified data security controls? Nobody had a unified data security goes across all assets on-premise and cloud. 43% had separate controls for on-premise and cloud. Separate gateway controls for different channels was 14%. Also 14% separate controls built into the products. Nobody had no data security controls in place, which is good to hear.
That's good news.
and then there's a few that came back that wasn't too sure.
Gotcha.
And then on the second, The second, do you allow unmanaged device access? Nobody allows unrestricted access, which is good. And surprisingly, nobody has a BYOD or CYOD policy. 20% allow partners and third parties. Another 20% provided restricted or reduced access. And 60% were managed devices only. Mm-hmm. So that unmanaged space were just a big fat no for 60% of the people on the call. So quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that tallies with the experience which we see as well. It's like, and it's quite interesting because often our sales organizations will talk a lot about the unmanaged device use case, but then two out of three customers, it's like, yeah, I'm not ready for that. I don't feel safe enabling that yet. And that's something I think we as an industry need to work on, because if we can enable them to embrace more of these things safely, then they can actually take advantage of some of the business benefits and efficiencies, and accelerate the business value which comes from being able to adopt those, the shadow IT and the personal devices and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for the final poll, do you restrict which apps can access data? Nobody. 0% for data is available to any application. 25% cloud applications are controlled. 25% said local applications are controlled, and 50% that only corporate applications are permitted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, that's really interesting, because if we think about the shadow IT session from before, what we're hearing here is like 50% of the organizations are saying, no, corporate apps only. That means 50% of the organizations probably have a whole lot of data going into shadow IT where they've got no visibility and no control. So there could be some really interesting things to come out of that. And it was also really interesting to hear about the split between local versus cloud app controls, because it's where you have these gaps and where you start to separate out these policies, which is where data starts to leak. And there's a lot of studies out there which are have some flawed figures, shall we say, in terms of, they'll come up with an average cost per record, those kinds of policies that within strict guidelines or strict boundaries, they can be okay, but it's a general tool. They tend to get abused, and it can actually undermine the argument. There's some really good work which has been done by the Scientia Institute, which is led by a guy called Wade Baker, who developed the Verizon Data Breach Incident Report, back in the day. And if you take a look at their RS 2020 report, it will actually give you a range of typical breach costs based on industry size, industry vertical, and annual turnover, but also extreme events. And what's really interesting is that if you take a look at the smallest and the largest customers, organizations, then the differential between the typical breach cost is like, for an organization doing less than $100,000 a year, and this was based on a study of the FTSE, top 1,000. What's the US one? Not FTSE.
No. Carry on, it'll come back to you later.
Yes, sorry, a mental stop. So at the lowest end, if they do less than $100,000 a year revenue, then a typical data breach or data loss will cost them about $24,000, right? 24K doesn't sound like much, but that's a quarter of their annual revenue. So that's actually a pretty big deal. Whereas for an organization which does like 100 billion a year, a typical breach, that'd be like $292,000. It's only 10 or 12 times as much, right? But where it gets interesting is on the extreme events, because on the extreme events, which might only happen every couple of years, suddenly the losses are measured in the tens of millions rather than in the tens of thousands. And so I think it can be really helpful to look at how those change by industry, how those change by organization size, because it's by being able to illustrate how much risk an organization is exposed to, it's much easier for the CISOs and the IT managers and so on to demonstrate return on the investment for the security tools and to get budget when they go to the board, because they can provide a very clear economic benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have a couple of questions, but what I'm going to do is jump through to just close off the Bytes bit, and then I'll ask all three presenters to come back, and then John, I'll ask your questions first, just because we've only got about 5 minutes or so left. So just wanted to kind of make sure I cover this bit before we get everybody back on. So kind of next steps, how can we help people, and how do Bytes help our customers in this space? So there's 3 assessments, right? No, definitely not 3, there's 4. There's 4 assessments that I wanted to highlight at the end of the session. So first one being a data risk assessment. And this is all about offering a free of charge assessment to look at a subset of your Office 365 data to understand and prove whether there is or isn't a compliance risk with that data. So Stephen talked in detail around Teams, and this is an assessment that has been rolled out across a number of customers to find out where their risks are, if any, yeah, a huge uptake of this, and it's been really useful. We'll continue to roll out that assessment. So that's a data risk assessment. The next 2 lends itself to the shadow IT / shadow data assessment. So again, running tools on your environment to understand what that posture could look like. Certainly looking at those kind of 50% of all, or 60% of organizations that said that they don't allow any unmanaged applications. This is a way where we can provide tools, again, free of charge, to run across your environment to give you visibility of any applications that sit outside of that managed space and unmanaged, and then allow you to provide the controls to manage that appropriately, whether they become unmanaged or you put true restrictions on there to stop any individuals using those. And the CyberSec workshop is kind of taking a step back. So this is much more of a consultative engagement that we would run using our internal resources with the organizations to understand your security posture across cloud and on-premise as a much more wider remit. Again, all assessments kind of free of charge. It allows us to provide huge amounts of value to our customers, and we like having these types of engagements because we get a better understanding of your environment, your challenges, and we're able to advise on what kind of next steps and solutions and services are available for you. So I've got a couple of minutes left. If I ask the speakers to come back, there we go. And then John, we missed your Q&A, so I'll start with one for yourself. So you mentioned user behavior.
Yes.
Isn't that a bit like Big Brother?
Yeah, so that's actually every time we talk about user behavior, that's one of the first bits of pushback we regularly get. And I think there's 2 ways of looking at Big Brother, right? There's Big Brother 1984, right? The overbearing, oppressive monitoring and mind control. There's my big brother, my sibling, who looks after his little brother, right? And that simple framing can often help organizations better appreciate the benefits which can come from this behavioral monitoring. I think the other element which is really important to note is that it doesn't mean absolutely every detail is monitored all the time. You have, if you like, a policy-based, automatic computer policy-based escalation of inspection based on the activity. As your risk score goes up, it might start to look at more details. It might start to log more detail, so that if it becomes necessary to do an investigation, then it is possible for the administrator to do that quickly and easily. And the last thing I'd say is that sometimes people think it's there to catch them out. But again, going back to my big brother looking after me thing, if I've had my credentials compromised, it can just as easily prove me innocent. Yeah, because it's not about trying to point the finger of blame. It's about trying to protect the users and the data. and that means it's protecting me. It's not attacking me. Sorry, it's a long answer. I hope that answers.
No, brilliant. Thank you. This one looks like it's this one's for Kieran. So I have applications in both Azure and AWS. Can Volterra provide a consistent set of security controls across both clouds, or do I still need to use native tools such as AWS WAF, etc.?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's exactly what we're trying to do here with Volterra. So think of it as a platform to deliver those distributed cloud services. So you've obviously got your applications wherever you may choose to put them. Volterra is sitting over the top, and outside of the things like network stitching, it's there to be able to provide a common set of security services so that it doesn't matter where your applications are living. A good example is, let's say you use cloud native WAF, you set a firewall policy up in AWS on a WAF. That's a completely different WAF to the Azure native WAF. So you can't just pick up the policies and move them onto there. So using something like Volterra over the top will give you a common security element that you can then transfer across all of your different applications.
Perfect. Just check here. Okay, cool. So this one, Stephen, is for you, and it says Varonis has a reputation for being expensive. How has the organization looked to change this in recent times?
That's a good one. So the main change has been a move from perpetual to subscription-based licensing, and a move to a modular. I took the doubling down on a modular approach for the solution. I think, given that, it means that the point of entry to our solution is a lot lower for most organizations. They obviously looking at a subscription term rather than buying a perpetual license and support, which makes life a lot easier. Moving from a CapEx to an OpEx model suits most organizations. I will say, probably a bit cheekily, that it's reassuringly expensive, and it's obviously all down to value at the end of the day. Right?
Get what you pay for.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So I think there's a poll being shown. I can't see it, but you should be able to see it on your screens. So I won't read that through. But concluding to today's event, thank you for everyone for spending the time with us. I hope you found it useful. Feedback forms are hugely important to us, and you've got a chance of winning £100 worth of vouchers. So if you win that, then 2 minutes of your time to fill that out is definitely time well spent. We've got one more session for this afternoon with JP Breezes. He's an 8 times MVP from Microsoft. I don't know if any of you have seen him spoken in the past. I certainly have. Extremely compelling speaker. If you've got the time, I recommend that you spend some time joining that session. As I said earlier, all of the sessions from Cloud Security Week are recorded and will be provided to you on demand. So please share with colleagues or revisit anything that you've missed. And just before I close, I'd just like to thank all of the guest speakers for today. I found it really, really useful myself, and I'm sure everybody else did who joined. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your days, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one of these. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to everyone for the time as well.